As an investigator, every case I worked on was important to me. This was one of the most challenging.
When a badly beaten woman is found on a dirt road near a major interstate, detectives can only hope she will live to tell her story.
When a person is a victim of a traumatic head injury, there's no telling how much they're going to remember about the crime. And in this case, we didn't know if the victim was going to survive.
With the victim on the brink of death, will investigators be able to find the person who left her for dead? Tallahassee, Florida, known for its southern charm and some of the state's most beautiful sights. But on one November day, a couple driving on the outskirts of town spot a severely beaten woman lying on the side of a dirt road. Horrified, they race to get help. Deputy Bill Stafford of the Leon County Sheriff's Office is the first to respond to the scene.
At approximately 1:30, I was dispatched to a wooded area on Gearhart Road. This was in reference to a woman that was seen seriously injured, and upon arrival, I found the woman attempting to make her way out of these woods.
As Stafford approaches the woman, he notices she is about to go into shock. It is clear she has been sexually assaulted and severely beaten.
I could see at that point that she was very seriously injured, had a lot of serious head injuries. I wrapped her in a blanket and went to the radio to call for an ambulance. At that point, I wasn't real sure that she was going to make it until the ambulance got there.
Finally, the paramedics arrive and the woman is rushed to the hospital. Deputy Stafford stays behind and combs the area, looking for clues that might explain what happened.
I located the area that supposedly was where the crime occurred and found a large piece of concrete on the ground where the victim was lying when the suspect threw the concrete down on her head.
And right nearby, more crucial evidence. A pair of green overalls and a purse, identifying the woman as 20-year-old Sandy Richards from New Zealand. But how did Richards end up here, on the side of the road? Canvassing the neighborhood, Stafford finds some witnesses who'd noticed a suspicious car in the area.
I gathered some information from the witnesses. There was a car that was parked down the road from the crime scene with some other individuals, and they also got a tag number.
Police immediately put out a bulletin to be on the lookout for the car. They scour the city for a sign of the vehicle, but find nothing. As Sandy Richards hovers on the brink of death, detectives learn more about the young woman from a phone number found in her purse. Captain Jack Pottinger of the Leon County Sheriff's Office oversees the case.
The young lady in this case was 20 years old at the time. She left New Zealand, came to the United States. She was hoping to obtain a job as a nanny and to obtain employment in Panama City, Florida.
But how did she end up on a dirt road over 100 miles away from Panama City? Investigators wait to see if she'll recover and answer that question.
She had a total of 5 major surgeries while she was here. Everybody's concern was that she'd survive. Obviously, she was the best source of information for the investigators as to what ultimately happened to her.
But while the victim remains in critical care, the case comes to a standstill until Captain Pottinger calls on investigator Dale Hinman for help.
When I was dispatched to the hospital, I was told the victim was probably not going to make it. When I saw her and saw the extent of her injuries, I was surprised she was alive.
Hinman feels certain that this is a homicide attempt that failed.
Based on what we knew from the crime scene and the information we had so far, we all believed the attacker had left this victim for dead.
As Sandy Richards struggles for her life, investigators send a crucial piece of evidence to the lab for analysis: the green overalls found at the crime scene. Tallahassee's crime lab analyst, Karen Martin, meticulously searches for evidence from the assault.
After examining the item visually, I use an alternate light source to try and find stains that fluoresce, which would be a possible indication for the presence of semen.
Under the blue light, Martin spots what she thinks could be traces of evidence.
I then take samples for both a presumptive test and a confirmatory test. The presumptive test is where I add a couple of chemicals, and if the color change is produced, then that's indications for the presence of semen.
The lab is able to confirm the presence of DNA evidence, but there's still no suspect to provide a match. Then, the break investigators have been hoping for. Sandy Richards is showing the unmistakable signs of recovery.
Once Sandy was able to talk, we hoped she would remember some detail that would help us to find the man who did this to her.
But remembering the details of a traumatic event can be difficult, even impossible. Agent Hinman consults with forensic psychologist Dr. Patrick Cook to develop a strategy to unlock Sandy's memory.
Very well. How about you?
Well, as you know, when somebody's been through a life-threatening trauma like that, it may or may not affect their memory. Some people have a very acute, very sharp memory of what happened to them. Some people don't want to remember it or don't want to believe it happened to them. And some people even may develop some false memories to fill in the gaps of what they don't remember. So I think it's real important that when you talk with her, she not feel pressure from you to come up with a memory.
So just to ask very open-ended questions and let her remember what she can about conversations and descriptions and items in the vehicle and things that he might have said and the direction of their travel.
Agent Hinman knows that initially, Richards will feel lost and disoriented.
I can't imagine what that would be like to be so far away from your family and so far away from any of your friends or anything that's familiar to you and be in a hospital all by yourself.
Well, as you know, in a post-traumatic stress syndrome, it's very, very important to have some kind of support system. That could work in your favor because if she trusts you, then you may be able to elicit some of those memories that are just kind of below the surface.
With a solid strategy in hand, Agent Hinman resumes her vigil by Sandy's bedside. Finally, it starts to work. Bit by bit, Sandy's memories of what happened that day start to surface.
Sandy decided that the next stop in her trip across the U.S. would be New Orleans. She could renew her visa there and stay at a youth hostel. Hitchhiking is a very common way to travel in New Zealand, so she didn't think anything of it.
Sandy recalls getting into a car with a black male who said his name was James. It's not long before she realizes something isn't right.
He signaled a turn and started to pull off, and Sandy asked him where he was going, and he said he had a package in the trunk of his car that he wanted to drop off at a friend's, and it would be a very quick stop. Well, she thought better of this and asked him to stop the car, and she would stay closer to the highway and get a ride with someone else.
James refuses to stop and turns onto a dirt road.
Sandy realized very quickly what his intentions were. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. He struck her several times and then sexually assaulted her. The last thing that she remembered was being strangled with the straps of her bib overalls.
At that point, she blacks out. Then, She remembers waking up and crawling toward the main road. Agent Hinman is grateful to know the broad outlines of the crime, but there's still not enough detail to pinpoint a suspect. For that, she'll need to return to the crime scene, accompanied by Captain Pottinger. By visiting the area, Hinman hopes to understand why Sandy's attacker chose this particular spot to make his move.
Dale, this is the area where the victim was found. It's been pretty deserted, pretty remote. There's not a great deal of residents down here.
The investigators begin to connect what they see with what the victim told them.
He drove all the way to the end to determine if there were in fact houses here or if the road continued on. But once he realized how secluded this area was, he pulled into this road to attack the victim. Well, it sounds more like to me that he's really not familiar with this area and he's not from here.
Agent Hinman believes the attacker is a transient passing through town. If he were from the area, he would have driven to a familiar place without seeming lost.
Your neck.
Unfortunately, the driver could be anyone.
Which means that this is the area where the victim was found back here. And you can see it's kind of a small depressed area. What we learned from the crime scene tech who came and worked the scene is that they found a large piece of concrete block. Appears that he used that to strike her head with.
Well, it looks like the individual is using only items that are readily available at the crime scene, like the straps of the victim's garment and the cement blocks from the scene. So it looks as though he hasn't come to the scene prepared to commit the attack, but that he got this idea as they were traveling along and then used items that were available at the scene, which probably suggests that he's not a very experienced killer, that he doesn't bring his own preferred method.
Well, that really is consistent with the fact that, I mean, here you have a girl from New Zealand who's hitchhiking. She's hitchhiking from Panama City. He brings her to Tallahassee, to this desolate area, believing that if he does kill her, that nobody's going to be able to find her body. If they do, they won't be able to identify her. She's kind of a disposable victim.
Absolutely.
But not as disposable as her attacker thought. Sandy Richards is about to remember a critical detail. Coming up next. As Sandy Richards recovers from the attempt on her life, she remembers a detail investigators have desperately been waiting for.
Sandy had only been in the country for a short period of time, so she was not that familiar with American cars. She remembered that the car was white and had burgundy interior, and that Oldsmobile was written on the car.
Using a book that describes every Oldsmobile ever made, Hinman tries to tap into Sandy's memory for more specific details. And it works. Coming across a photo of a specific model, Sandy excitedly identifies it as the assailant's car.
Sandy was able to pick out a two-door Oldsmobile Toronado, and she said it had a digital clock and a compass on the dashboard.
Instantly flooded with memories, she is able to recall another precious detail.
Sandy indicated that the person who attacked her had something to do with aerosol manufacturing. Said he worked at a plant in Miami manufacturing aerosol containers.
Investigators begin a statewide manhunt.
We did an extensive search in the state of Florida for late model two-door white Oldsmobiles that might have been registered to the black male, that might also be employed at an aerosol manufacturing plant. We visited a number of plants, talked to a number of employees and supervisors, but we were not able to locate anybody that matched our particular description.
Without a suspect, the case goes cold. Sandy Richards returns home to New Zealand, knowing that her attacker is still on the loose. And for years, the unsolved case continues to haunt Agent Hinman. It's the one case she can never seem to forget.
Because I had spent so much time with Sandy during the course of this investigation, perhaps this case became a little more personal to me. We became friends. I often thought of her over the years. I wondered how she was, and I wondered what I could do to solve this case.
As her experience in dealing with the criminal mind deepens, Agent Hinman decides to revisit the Sandy Richards case. She has a theory, and she wants to discuss it with forensic psychologist Dr. Patrick Cook.
What I've been thinking is, based on all the other cases that I've seen over the years, that these sexually related or sexually natured type of crimes are committed by someone who will repeat this type of crime over and over again.
I agree with you. I think with the combination of the sexual violence and the physical violence, it's entirely possible that he's committed some other crimes.
If Sandy's attacker has reoffended since then, he may have been arrested at some point. If so, there may finally be a way to identify him.
Since this crime has occurred, there's been so many developments in the DNA arena, and if we resubmit the evidence in this case, there's a possibility we may match some other crime from somewhere else in the state or in the country.
Carefully preserved evidence in the sheriff's vault could provide the key. The DNA on Sandy Richards' overalls is reanalyzed at the Tallahassee Crime Lab. David Kaufman compares the genetic profile to the Florida database for convicted offenders.
In the late 90s, a new procedure was developed. It's called STR, which stands for short tandem repeat. It's very discriminating. You can get results on much smaller samples. It works much better on degraded samples, and it's also much quicker to get a result. Well, when the case was resubmitted for analysis, a DNA profile was developed. That profile was put into the forensic index here within the state of Florida, and then I conducted a search against the convicted offender index.
But will they find a match or just another dead end? Coming up next. When DNA from the Sandy Richards case is run through the Florida Offender Database years after the case has gone cold, they get a hit.
Once we conducted the search, we found that one individual out of our entire database matched this particular case, and that individual's name was Willie Oliver.
Willie Oliver is now 55 years old and lives just outside of Tampa. And just as Hinman had predicted, his DNA was entered into the convict database several years ago when he committed another crime.
When investigators looked into Willie Oliver's background, they discovered he had a criminal record. He had been arrested for aggravated battery, served time in prison, and he had been released.
And investigators aren't surprised to learn that Oliver never worked with aerosol products as he claimed. They now suspect it was simply a ploy to buy time while planning his next move with the victim.
Based on the DNA database hit, a warrant was obtained for Willie Oliver's arrest. At the time of the arrest, he claimed he had never even been to the Tallahassee area, but none of us really expected him to confess.
Although Willie Oliver denies any involvement in the crime, he is arrested and brought to Tallahassee for trial, where he must face the irrefutable DNA evidence. And that's not the only thing he'll face. The prosecutor is someone who's been with the case from the start. Captain Jack Pottinger is now a state's attorney, and he wouldn't dream of letting anyone else prosecute this case.
In the course of the struggle, our overalls get torn.
One by one, investigators take the stand, including Agent Hinman, who's waited years for this moment.
Did she provide you that description?
Yes, she did.
Do you recall when that interview would have taken place?
In between her being treated by the doctor, she went to x-ray, different people were hustling around the room, and as time would allow, I would sit with the victim and ask her questions about the description so that this information could be given to the uniformed officers right away so they could look for an offender.
Sandy Richards has made the trip back to the United States to testify. Shy of the cameras, she still bravely recounts the aftermath of her attack.
Well, apart from the scarring on my face, I have limited vision in my left eye. I can see, but it's not a brilliant sight. I don't have my front teeth.
In the end, dedicated police work and DNA evidence can't be overcome. Willie Oliver is found guilty of the sexual assault and attempted murder of Sandy Richards.
Well, to me, this is a prime example that justice delayed is not always justice denied.
Oliver is sentenced to life in prison. The case that no one could forget is finally closed.
Willie Oliver probably thought he had committed the perfect crime. He sexually assaulted his victim and left her for dead. But technology finally caught up with him and helped to bring Sandy the justice that was long overdue.